Helen Miller sat back in her favorite armchair, the one that had seen countless evenings of lesson planning, grading papers, and quiet moments of reflection. The soft hum of silence filled the room as she adjusted the curtains to let the golden afternoon light flood in. At 67, she had finally earned the right to relax, to live life on her own terms. After 35 years of molding young minds in the classrooms of Lincoln Elementary in Columbus, Ohio, Helen had walked away from the profession she loved with a smile on her face and a heart full of memories. For the first time in decades, she had no lesson plans to prepare, no students to worry about, and no deadlines to meet. Her days were her own. The weight of a lifetime of responsibilities had lifted, and Helen was determined to make the most of it. The brochures on her coffee table were a symbol of that newfound freedom: Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon, and the Pacific Coast Highway, places she'd always dreamed of visiting but had put off for years. There was a deep excitement in her chest as she ran her fingers over the glossy pages. This was going to be her time. She had earned it. As Helen sipped her chamomile tea, her thoughts drifted to the years that had passed. Raising Michael as a single mother, working tirelessly to ensure he had everything he needed, had left little time for herself. She smiled wistfully as she remembered those early mornings, the long nights of study sessions, and the sacrifices she'd made to send him off to Ohio State University. Michael had always been her pride and joy, the reason she kept going even when things were tough. Her phone broke through her reverie. The screen lit up with the name Brooke, Michael's wife. Helen hesitated for a moment, wondering what this call would bring. Every time Brooke called, it was always for something, never just a simple check-in. With a sigh, she answered, "Hello, Brooke." "Helen, I need a favor." Brooke's voice came through, sharp and direct. No pleasantries. Helen braced herself. "What is it now?" "I'm heading to Miami for a multi-level marketing conference. It's going to change our lives, you know. Anyway, I'm leaving the kids with you. Aiden, Chloe, and Leo. You don't do anything anymore, so you can watch them while I'm gone." The words hit Helen like a slap in the face. She tried to keep her voice steady. "I'm retired, Brooke. I have plans." "Plans?" Brooke chuckled, a cold, condescending laugh that made Helen's blood boil. "What plans can an old woman like you have? Knitting, soap operas. You're not busy, Helen. You have all the time in the world now." Helen's fingers tightened around her phone. A mixture of anger and disbelief swirled inside her. The nerve of this woman, who had never lifted a finger in her life, to belittle her so casually. She had spent her life working, raising her son, building a career. And now this, to be treated like a free babysitter with no regard for the life she had worked so hard to build. "I'm not going to watch them for you, Brooke," Helen said, her voice barely a whisper. "Excuse me." Brooke's voice grew sharper. "What do you mean you're not going to watch them? You're their grandmother, for God's sake. It's your obligation." Helen's heart pounded. She could feel the years of resentment boiling up, the years of Brooke's passive-aggressive comments and manipulations. This wasn't just about babysitting. It was about control. It was about disrespect. "You know what, Brooke? Fine, bring them over tomorrow, but don't expect me to spoil them like you do. They're not your little puppets. And don't tell me how to raise them either," Helen bit back, her voice colder than it had ever been. The silence on the other end was thick with tension. Helen could practically hear Brooke's lips curling into that condescending smile. "That's more like it. I'll drop them off tomorrow at 7, Brooke said, as if the conversation had ended. "And Helen, don't feed them junk food this time." The call ended abruptly, and Helen sat there, staring at the phone in her hand. The feeling of betrayal lingered, but it was mixed with something else, a sense of determination. Brooke had no idea what she was about to awaken. For years, Helen had let the injustices slide, swallowing her pride, biting her tongue for the sake of her son. But not anymore. Now she had the time, and she was going to make sure that this manipulation would stop. As Helen placed the phone down, she looked at the brochures once again, but this time something had changed. It wasn't about vacations anymore. It wasn't about her freedom. It was about justice, about taking a stand. And Brooke, she was about to get a lesson she would never forget. Tomorrow, the real education would begin. But it wouldn't be for the children. It would be for Brooke. Helen smiled to herself. Finally, she thought, finally, the tables were going to turn. The memories of those early years hit Helen like a tidal wave. She sat in her chair, the one by the window, where the light always seemed to warm her heart just enough to help her relive the past, but not so much that it burned. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the sun wash over her, and for a split second, she was transported back to a time when she was young, filled with the dreams of a future that would be as rich with love and joy as it would be with financial security. But that future was ripped away in an instant. It was a rainy October morning when everything changed. Richard, her husband, had kissed her goodbye, his voice warm as he promised to be back soon. He never came back. The car accident on I-80 that took 23 lives, including Richard, left Helen standing alone with a 3-year-old boy, Michael, and no real direction in life. Her whole world turned upside down in a split second, but somehow she had to keep it together. The first few months were pure survival. Her savings drained in the blink of an eye as she did everything she could to try and save Richard, only for him to pass away after 3 long days in the hospital. The hospital bills alone had emptied their bank account, and now Helen was left with nothing but her love for Michael and a teaching degree from a state university that seemed, at the time, like it might not be enough. She worked 2 jobs, double shifts, every single day. In the morning, she'd teach elementary school, helping other children understand the basics of reading and writing, while Michael was at daycare, unaware of the weight his mother was carrying. In the afternoons, when most parents were heading home to relax, Helen would work as a tutor. Some nights, she'd even take on odd jobs, babysitting, cleaning, anything to make sure there was food on the table. By the time Michael was old enough to start school, Helen had learned to run on little sleep. She wore a smile during the day, but when the sun set, exhaustion would settle into her bones. She kept it hidden, of course. There was no room for weakness. There was no room for her. She remembered one winter when Michael was just 6, and she had scraped together enough money for his Christmas present, a shiny new bicycle. She had been so proud of herself. She had saved every penny she could spare to make sure he had the one thing he wanted. But as Christmas Eve drew closer, the reality of her situation hit harder than ever. There wasn't enough money left for a Christmas dinner. There was nothing left for her. So Helen did what she had always done. She made a sacrifice. She sold her grandmother's locket, a precious heirloom that had been passed down through generations, for $50. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make sure Michael had the Christmas dinner he deserved. It was enough to make sure he had the warmth of turkey and stuffing, the kind of meal she had always imagined they share as a family, no matter how small it was. And Michael, to him, the world was perfect. He never knew the sacrifices. All he saw was his mother, the woman who made sure his life was filled with everything he needed. And that was enough for Helen. She worked herself to the bone, day in and day out, all for him. And every time she felt like she couldn't take it anymore, there was Michael. His laugh, his warmth, his hug, it was all worth it. By the time Michael was in high school, the expenses had multiplied. Books, clothes, bus fare, every penny she made went to supporting him. And still, she worked, squeezing every last ounce of energy she had left into making sure he had the future she had dreamed of for him. One of the hardest moments came when Michael got into Ohio State University for industrial engineering. Helen had sold her pies at bake sales for months to cover the costs. It wasn't easy, but she did it. And when Michael was accepted, she felt a pride that had been years in the making. Her son, the son she had raised alone, was going to college. He was going to have everything she couldn't, everything she dreamed of. But even as she celebrated, Helen knew the price she had paid. It wasn't just financial. It was emotional, too. Her life had become a series of sacrifices. She had given up friendships, family gatherings, vacations, everything that wasn't directly related to Michael's success. The years of working 2 jobs and pushing herself to the limit had worn her down. Her health had suffered. Her own desires and needs had faded into the background, buried beneath the weight of providing for her son. But she never once regretted it. And then, just as she thought things might get easier, just as she thought she could finally rest, the phone rang. Michael had met someone, Brooke. At first, Brooke had seemed like a breath of fresh air. She was sweet, bubbly, and showered Helen with compliments. She was everything Helen wasn't: young, energetic, and full of hope. She admired Helen for raising Michael on her own and often told her that she was her hero. And for a while, Helen believed it. It felt good to hear the words, to feel like someone saw the woman behind the tired, worn-out mother. But soon, she began to notice the cracks. The subtle, sharp comments. The way Brooke would imply that Michael's ambition was lacking, or how she'd criticize the simplicity of Helen's life. Every time Brooke spoke, it was as though a tiny piece of Helen's heart chipped away. Still, Helen endured it. For Michael, always for Michael. Because that was what mothers did. And Helen had been a mother, a single mother, for so long that it had become her identity. But as she sat in her armchair, looking back on it all, Helen knew something had changed. The phone call from Brooke, the casual dismissal of everything Helen had worked for, was the last straw. It wasn't just about the grandchildren. It was about everything she had given up, everything she had sacrificed to make sure Michael could live the life he deserved. And now, for the first time in years, Helen was ready to put herself first. She wasn't just going to be a doormat anymore. She wasn't going to let Brooke's manipulations continue to control her life. No, now, Helen Miller was going to take back control. And Brooke, she was going to get a lesson she would never forget. This time, Helen would fight back, not just for herself, but for the children she loved so deeply. The battle had only just begun. When Helen first met Brooke, she was nothing but sunshine. Michael had invited her over for Sunday dinner, and as soon as Helen opened the door, there she stood, smiling brightly, with a warmth that seemed to radiate from her. Brooke was young, in her early 20s, with the kind of energy that made everything seem possible. She was a breath of fresh air to Helen, who had spent years building her life around sacrifice, quiet perseverance, and hard-earned wisdom. Brooke seemed like the perfect contrast to the hard edges of Helen's life. "Hi, Mrs. Miller," Brooke had greeted, pulling Helen into a tight hug. "Michael talks about you all the time. You're his hero." Helen had smiled, the compliment easing some of the tension she always felt when meeting Michael's girlfriends. But Brooke wasn't like the others. She genuinely seemed to admire Helen, a trait Helen found both surprising and endearing. At first, it felt good to be seen, to be acknowledged for the years of struggle and sacrifice. Michael's words of gratitude had always been there, but to hear them from someone else, someone new, made Helen feel a little less invisible. At dinner, Brooke spoke with enthusiasm about her small-town roots in West Virginia, her father a coal miner and her mother a waitress. Helen could relate to the grit in her story. They had both worked hard, scraping by, but never giving up. They were survivors, she thought, and for a time, Helen bought into it. Brooke seemed to effortlessly fill the empty spaces in Helen's life, and she didn't shy away from Helen's cooking, even after a less-than-perfect roast. "This is delicious, Mrs. Miller," she had said, and Helen felt a small swell of pride. "You know," Brooke had continued, leaning in with a secretive smile, "you remind me so much of my mom. She always worked hard to put food on the table, just like you." The words should have been flattering, but something about the way Brooke said them, the subtle emphasis on the comparison, left a knot in Helen's stomach. Yet she dismissed the feeling, pushing it aside. After all, this was Michael's happiness, his choice. But as the months went on, Helen began to notice the small, almost imperceptible shifts in Brooke's behavior, things she had initially shrugged off but were slowly adding up. Brooke would visit, but only for short amounts of time, and often she would take Michael aside for private conversations. At first, it seemed innocent, but then Helen started hearing the complaints. "You know, Michael doesn't have as much drive as he should," Brooke said one day, her voice laced with concern. They were sitting at the kitchen table, Helen sipping her coffee, when Brooke casually let the words fall. "He's not very ambitious, and I think it's because he didn't have a father growing up." Helen had been stunned. The words felt like a slap, but she simply smiled through it, her fingers tightening around her mug. "He had a strong mother," Helen replied, keeping her voice even, though a flicker of hurt passed through her heart. She worked tirelessly to make sure Michael never felt the absence of his father. But for Brooke, the silence in Michael's life was always something to blame her for. That was just the beginning. Brooke's comments, though soft-spoken and coated in sugar, began to chip away at Helen's confidence. She'd comment on the way Helen raised Michael, as if she could have done it better. "You know," Brooke had said once with a delicate laugh, "I don't know how you did it, Helen. It's amazing. But Michael could have had more if he'd just had better guidance in his youth, maybe a father figure." Helen's chest tightened at the insinuation, but she kept her smile in place, not allowing Brooke to see her reaction. Over the years, these casual jabs continued, disguised as helpful suggestions or concern. Brooke's dismissive attitude toward Helen's efforts became more apparent. Little by little, she undermined the role Helen had played in Michael's life. The woman who had sacrificed everything, who had worked long hours, given up dreams, and raised her son with love and devotion, was constantly being belittled. It wasn't overt. It wasn't obvious. But it was there, under the surface, like a slow, creeping poison. Helen started feeling the weight of it more often than not. She was no longer just Michael's mother. She was becoming a figure to be tolerated, a woman who could be used, like an old fixture in the house, one that could be counted on when needed but easily dismissed when inconvenient. And Brooke made it clear, without ever having to say it outright, that Helen was disposable. One evening, Michael had come home exhausted from work, slumping into the armchair as usual, while Brooke busied herself with her phone. As Helen entered the room, she overheard Brooke's voice, a soft murmur, but still cutting. "I don't know why you let her have so much say in things, Michael. You know, your mother is nice and all, but her advice is a bit old-fashioned. We're modern people now. You need to move forward, not be stuck in the past." Helen stood frozen at the door, her heart hammering in her chest. The subtle sting of those words settled into her, but she didn't respond, not then. What could she say? Michael didn't hear it, or if he did, he ignored it. But Helen knew. She knew what was happening, even if Michael didn't. Brooke had already begun weaving herself into the fabric of their family, her manipulations soft but effective. She was rewriting the narrative. And Helen, she was being slowly erased. It wasn't just about Brooke's disregard for Helen's contributions. It was about her need for control, her subtle but steady attempt to reshape the family's story, one where she was at the center, and Helen was nothing more than an afterthought. Brooke wasn't just Michael's wife. She was a strategist, a manipulator who knew how to bend situations to her will. And with each passing day, it became clearer that the story wasn't just about her and Michael anymore. It was about taking everything Helen had worked for and turning it into something that fit her narrative. The tension between Helen and Brooke, once small and fleeting, was now undeniable. Helen could no longer ignore it. The manipulation, the dismissals, the subtle undermining, it was all part of a bigger plan, and Helen had finally begun to see it. She had spent years raising Michael, giving everything she had to him, to ensure he became the man he was. But now, as his life continued with Brooke, she found herself fighting for something much bigger. Not just her place in Michael's life, but her right to stand tall, her right to be seen and respected. Helen's battle was just beginning, and she was ready. The phone rang, its sharp tone cutting through the quiet of Helen's living room like a jolt of electricity. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the screen, the name Brooke flashing brightly. For a moment, she almost ignored it, but deep down, she knew she couldn't. It was always something. Helen took a breath, steeling herself for whatever was coming. She had learned long ago to brace for these calls. Brooke never called without an agenda. And in that moment, the dread was palpable. She could already feel the familiar stirrings of frustration building up inside her. "Hello, Brooke," Helen answered, her voice steady but laced with the quiet tension she had come to expect from these conversations. "Helen, I need a favor," Brooke's voice came through, casual, as if asking for a favor was a normal thing, something friends did for each other. Helen could almost hear her smirking on the other end. "I'm heading to Miami for a multi-level marketing conference. It's a huge opportunity. It's going to change our lives, you know, so I need you to take care of the kids." The words felt like an ice-cold slap. Helen's grip tightened around the phone, her knuckles whitening. She could already feel the heat rising in her chest. Brooke was already in motion. Her words came rapid fire, without a breath. "You don't do anything anymore, so it's perfect. Just watch Aiden, Chloe, and Leo for me while I'm gone. I'll drop them off tomorrow at 7 in the morning. And don't forget, no junk food like last time, okay? Helen closed her eyes, biting back the anger that surged through her veins. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't asked for the disrespect, for the demands that always seemed to fall on her shoulders. But there it was again, that entitled tone, the same one that had echoed through so many of their past conversations. She thought back to the times when Brooke would dismiss her, belittle her efforts, make her feel as if everything Helen had done for Michael, for their family, was somehow inadequate. She thought of the jabs at her age, her cooking, her life. The years of quietly enduring, swallowing the bitter pills of disrespect, all while she bent over backwards to make sure her son and his family were taken care of. But this was different. "Brooke, I'm retired," Helen said, her voice low, controlled, though her anger burned just beneath the surface. "I've worked my whole life and now I'm finally taking time for myself. I don't owe you anything." "Oh, come on, Helen, don't play that card," Brooke laughed, a cold, dismissive laugh. "You've got nothing but time. Besides, I need to go. This conference could change everything for us. It's a once-in-a-lifetime thing. The kids can stay with you for just a couple of weeks. You're their grandmother." "It's your job." Helen's blood ran cold at the word job. Job? What did Brooke know about sacrifice? About doing everything for the ones you love, with no reward, no recognition, just because it was the right thing to do? What did she know about giving up your own life, your own happiness, for the sake of others? Her jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, Helen allowed herself to remember the countless hours she had spent raising Michael, the sacrifices she had made to ensure he grew up right, to provide him with a future. And here she was, being asked to babysit, again, as if she were nothing more than a free daycare. "I'm not going to watch them for you, Brooke," Helen said firmly, her voice shaking slightly with suppressed fury. "I've got my own life now, and I'm not your free babysitter." There was a silence on the other end of the line, a silence that stretched, thick and heavy. Helen could feel Brooke's irritation, could practically see the smirk fading from her face as the tension mounted. "Oh, I see. So now you're going to make excuses." Brooke's voice was laced with venom. "Well, you know what, Helen? If you don't want to help me out, that's fine. But remember, this isn't just about you anymore. You're their grandmother. They need you. And if you want to keep seeing them, you'd better do what I ask." The threat hung in the air like a bad smell. "You know, Michael will agree with me," Brooke continued, her tone sharp, accusatory. "You don't want to be the one to come between us, do you?" Helen felt her heart skip a beat. The subtle manipulation, the way Brooke always used Michael as her shield, made Helen's blood boil. How could she still use him like that? How could she still twist everything to make Helen feel guilty for wanting a little peace in her own life? The thought of Michael, overworked and oblivious to Brooke's scheming, made Helen's resolve harden. No more. No more playing the martyr, no more letting Brooke manipulate her for convenience. "I'm not going to do this for you, Brooke," Helen said again, her voice unwavering. "You can drop the kids off tomorrow if you want, but don't expect me to take this lying down anymore. I've been quiet for far too long, and I won't just let you walk all over me any longer." There was another beat of silence on the other end, a pause that seemed to stretch on forever before Brooke finally responded. "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you. You won't be the one they remember." Helen didn't respond. Instead, she hung up, her heart pounding in her chest. The tension in her body didn't dissipate, not immediately. Her mind was racing, thoughts swirling. Could she really stand up to Brooke this time? Could she really draw a line in the sand? As she set the phone down, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the years of silent endurance. Years of biting her tongue. Years of putting her son's family before her own. It had to stop. It was time to take control. Brooke had just ignited something in Helen that had been smoldering for years. She wasn't just going to be pushed around anymore. The power struggle had begun, and this time Helen was ready. Helen sat quietly in her armchair, the late afternoon sunlight casting long shadows across the room. She stared out the window, watching as the world outside seemed to continue on, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her. The phone call from Brooke still echoed in her mind, the words cutting deeper with every passing second. You're their grandmother. It's your job." Those words, so casually spoken, filled her with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Job. She had never seen her role as a mother or a grandmother as a mere duty. Raising Michael had been her life's work, her life's pride. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every missed opportunity had been made willingly, out of love, not obligation. Yet here she was, being told she was nothing more than a glorified babysitter. As the quiet settled over her, Helen let her mind wander back through the years. She had taught for 35 years, shaping minds, guiding children, and shaping the future of the generations she had touched. It wasn't just a job. It had been her passion, her purpose. She had fought for every child who came through her classroom doors, nurturing them with patience and care, teaching them not only reading and writing, but the lessons of kindness, respect, and responsibility. And yet, despite all her years of dedication, all her hard work, she had allowed one person to manipulate her, to treat her as if she were less than she was. That person was Brooke. No more, Helen thought. It was time to stand up for herself, time to remind herself that she was not just a silent participant in this family. She had earned her place, her respect, and she wasn't going to let anyone, not even her own daughter-in-law, take that from her. Helen had always prided herself on being strong. In the classroom, when a child struggled, she was there to support them. When a parent was difficult, she found a way to navigate the tension. She had spent years teaching others how to stand tall, how to find their voice, and now it was her turn to use those lessons for herself. She wasn't just going to let Brooke walk all over her anymore. Her decisions settled in her chest like a solid rock. She wasn't just going to let Brooke dictate the terms anymore. She was going to take control of her life, of her family, and of the situation that had spiraled out of control for far too long. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Helen was no stranger to hard work. She had spent decades fighting for her son's future, doing whatever it took to make sure he had the best opportunities. Now, she would fight for herself, for her peace of mind, and for the future of her grandchildren. But this fight would be different. This time, she was going to use every tool at her disposal, every lesson she had learned over the years. Helen wasn't alone in this. Her mind immediately turned to Carol, an old friend from the early years of her teaching career. Carol had always been there for her, whether it was lending an ear after a tough day or offering advice when Helen needed it most. Over the years, Carol had also gone through her own share of challenges, and they had stayed close, supporting one another through thick and thin. Helen grabbed her phone and dialed Carol's number, her fingers steady despite the rush of adrenaline in her veins. The line rang twice before Carol's familiar voice came through. "Hey, Helen, how are you?" "I'm good, Carol," Helen replied, her voice calm but resolute. "Actually, I need your help with something." "Oh," Carol's tone shifted, sensing the gravity in Helen's voice. "What's going on?" "I'm done, Carol. Done being the one who always takes the back seat, the one who lets everyone walk all over her," Helen said, her words quick and sharp. "Brooke crossed a line, and I can't take it anymore. She thinks she can use me, manipulate me, just because she's married to my son. She's wrong." Carol paused for a moment, then spoke carefully. "I've seen it, Helen. I've heard you talk about her, and I know how much you've sacrificed for Michael and the family. What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking it's time I start teaching Brooke a lesson she will never forget," Helen said, her voice gaining strength with every word. "But I can't do this alone. I need help, and I know you're the one to help me." There was a long pause, but when Carol spoke again, her voice was filled with confidence. "Of course, Helen. I'll do whatever it takes. You've been there for me, and now it's my turn to be there for you. What's your plan?" Helen exhaled, a slow breath that felt like it was carrying the weight of the past few years with it. "I've been thinking about this for a while now. I'm going to gather evidence. I'm going to expose Brooke for what she really is, manipulative, selfish, and entitled. But I need more than just my word. I need proof." "I'm on it," Carol said, her voice steady and supportive. "I've got connections. My sister works at Child Protective Services, and she can help with anything involving the kids. We can make sure you have everything you need, legally, if it comes to that." Helen's heart lightened at the thought of having Carol's support. This was the first time in years she felt like she had someone she could rely on, someone who understood the gravity of the situation and who would stand beside her. "Thanks, Carol. I knew I could count on you," Helen said, her voice softer now, filled with gratitude. "It's time to show Brooke that the teacher doesn't just teach, she knows how to fight, and I'm going to make sure she gets the lesson she deserves." Carol laughed softly, the sound familiar and comforting. "You've always been a fighter, Helen. Now let's make sure Brooke learns that." Helen smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose wash over her. The path ahead was clear, and though the battle would be tough, she was ready. She had a plan, she had the resources, and most importantly, she had the willpower to win. Brooke wouldn't know what hit her. The doorbell rang precisely at 7:00 a.m., the sound slicing through the stillness of the house like a sharp reminder of what was about to unfold. Helen stood in the entryway, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The moment had arrived. Brooke's children were on their way. As she opened the door, there they were, Aiden, Chloe, and Leo, dragging their oversized suitcases behind them, their faces set in expressions of annoyance, as though the very act of coming to her house was a punishment they had been forced to endure. Helen smiled tightly, doing her best to mask the discomfort that bubbled up inside her. She was ready for this, or at least she told herself she was. It wasn't their fault, after all. They were just children, and in their minds, she was the enemy. They had been taught that by their mother, peace by manipulative peace, but she wasn't going to give up on them, not yet. "Come on in," she said, her voice gentle, but firm. The kids barely acknowledged her as they shuffled past her and into the living room. Aiden, the oldest, was already glued to his phone, barely sparing her a glance. Chloe shot Helen a look that could only be described as disdain, while Leo, young, but already showing signs of the emotional damage he'd been subjected to, stared around the room with suspicion. Helen closed the door quietly behind them, her gaze following their every move. They were still kids, of course, but their behavior didn't reflect that. They were entitled, spoiled by their mother's unchecked manipulation. Each of them had a hardened wall around them, one that had been built over time, brick, by Brooke's subtle and not-so-subtle teachings. She knew this wasn't going to be easy. She had heard all the horror stories from other grandparents whose relationships with their grandchildren had been strained by parental alienation. But what Brooke had done to her family, what she had done to these children, was far worse than anything Helen had ever imagined. "Do you want some breakfast?" Helen asked, doing her best to keep her tone neutral. Aiden didn't respond. He didn't even look up from his phone. Chloe sneered. "What do you even have here? Last time all you had was cereal. You can't even make real food, can you?" The words stung more than Helen had anticipated, but she refused to let them show. She had dealt with far worse in her classroom over the years. It was just another challenge to face, another wall to break down. Still, it wasn't easy. Helen had always prided herself on being able to connect with people, even difficult children. But these kids weren't just difficult. They were broken. And they didn't want anything to do with her. Every glance, every word felt like an accusation, like she was a stranger they had no reason to care for. It wasn't just the tension that had built up between them. It was the years of manipulation, of Brooke's subtle campaign to drive a wedge between them, to make sure they saw her as the villain. And that villain wasn't just a mother-in-law. It was the grandmother who didn't spoil them, who didn't give in to their every whim. Helen set the breakfast table, making pancakes shaped like animals, just the way Michael used to love them when he was young. She put out chocolate milk and fresh fruit, hopping to offer something that might break through their emotional walls. She wasn't going to be like Brooke. She wasn't going to force them to eat anything they didn't want, but she would make them feel welcome. After a long silence, Aiden finally looked up from his phone and muttered, "I'm not eating that." Chloe rolled her eyes, folding her arms across her chest. "Do you seriously think we want to eat your disgusting food?" Helen's hands tightened around the edge of the table. The sting of their words hit harder than she had expected. This was going to be harder than I thought, she realized. These were her grandchildren, the children she had hoped to share a relationship with. But right now, they seemed more like strangers, strangers who hated her, who resented her for reasons she didn't fully understand. But she wasn't going to back down. She could feel the weight of the years pressing down on her. All the years she had spent raising Michael, giving him everything she had, love, sacrifices, hard work. And now it seemed like none of that mattered. The children didn't see it. They didn't understand it. They had been taught to see her as the outsider, the one who didn't fit into the world their mother had built for them. But Helen wasn't going to let that break her. "You don't have to eat it," Helen said calmly, her voice steady even as her heart threatened to crack. "But if you want to stay here, you'll need to follow my rules. I don't mind if you don't like my food, but I do mind if you're rude." Aiden scoffed but didn't argue further. Chloe shot her a look, but Helen could see the faintest flicker of hesitation behind her eyes. Maybe there was more to these children than the hard, entitled exteriors they had built up. Maybe, deep down, they were still the little ones who had once needed love and care. But it wasn't going to be easy to reach them. It would take time. She made the decision right then. She wasn't going to fight them, not directly. She was going to teach them. Slowly, patiently, she would break through the walls Brooke had built around them, one piece at a time. "I'm going to take a walk in the garden," Helen said, standing up. "You can come with me or you can stay here, but no more complaining, not in my house." Leo was the first to look up, his eyes wide, as if unsure how to react to this new side of his grandmother. Chloe exchanged a glance with Aiden, her defiance momentarily faltering. There was something in Helen's tone, something that said she wasn't going to let them walk all over her anymore. Helen wasn't the frail, invisible grandmother they had been taught to see. She was strong. She was patient. And more than anything, she had something they didn't experience. The tension lingered in the air, but it wasn't as thick as it had been before. This was just the beginning, Helen knew. There would be more moments like this, more testing, more resistance, but she wasn't going to give up. She wasn't going to let Brooke's poison destroy what was left of her family. Helen had raised Michael with love, with hard work, and with boundaries. She would do the same for her grandchildren, even if it took every ounce of patience she had left. And one day soon. She hoped they would understand. They would see her not as the enemy, but as the person who cared enough to fight for them when no one else would. Helen spent the next few days preparing for the children's arrival with a quiet, steady determination. The whirlwind of emotions had settled, replaced by a calculated calm that only came from years of experience. She had been through countless challenges in her teaching career, dealing with difficult students, frustrated parents, and emotional crises. But this was different. This was her family. And this time, she wasn't going to wait for things to change on their own. She was going to make them change. Her years in the classroom had taught her more than just academic lessons. They had taught her how to understand people, how to read their behavior, recognize the triggers of frustration or anger, and most importantly, how to reach them when they needed it most. She wasn't going to win this battle by brute force. She wasn't going to yell, demand respect, or scold her grandchildren. No, Helen knew better. This would require patience, empathy, and above all, strategy. The first thing Helen did was assess the situation with clear eyes. The children, especially Aiden, Chloe, and Leo, had been exposed to years of Brooke's manipulation. They were confused, disillusioned, and hurt. They had been taught to see their mother's behavior as normal, to accept her lies as truth, and to view Helen as the outsider who didn't belong. The walls around them were thick, built with false narratives and emotional neglect. But Helen knew something that Brooke didn't. Children at their core craved love, stability, and authenticity. These kids weren't beyond saving. It would take time, yes. It would take small steps and subtle shifts, but Helen was prepared for the long haul. She had always believed in the power of education, not just academic education, but emotional and psychological education. And she was about to put that knowledge to the test. First, she made sure the environment in her home was welcoming. She wasn't going to force anything on them, but she was going to set the stage for something different. Her home was always a place of comfort for Michael, and she intended to make it a safe haven for her grandchildren, too. The smell of freshly baked cookies lingered in the air, a subtle invitation for them to settle in. A few simple changes, like keeping the TV remote out of sight and putting away the phone chargers, were small, but important signals that things would be different here. There was no room for distractions, no easy escapes into technology or avoidance. Helen's strategy was simple: break down the walls of entitlement and resistance and rebuild a foundation of responsibility and connection. The children needed structure, just like her students had, and they needed to understand that actions had consequences. But more than that, they needed to feel cared for, and that meant they would have to learn that love wasn't about giving them what they wanted, but giving them what they needed. It wasn't long before Helen began implementing small but effective routines. She started each morning with a simple breakfast ritual, just like she used to with Michael: pancakes shaped like animals, fruit cut into neat little stars, and a touch of humor to soften the atmosphere. At first, the children resisted, but it didn't take long before they began to eat more than just cereal bars or whatever quick fix they could grab. Helen knew that food was more than just sustenance. It was a way to connect, a way to show them that someone cared enough to make sure they were fed properly. But the real transformation would come with the lessons, the quiet ones that they wouldn't even realize they were learning. She began by encouraging them to talk about their day, what they had enjoyed, what they had learned. For Aiden, this meant breaking through his stoic, rebellious exterior. Helen had noticed the way he would shut down when asked to talk about anything meaningful, but with patience and a gentle prodding, she started to get him to open up. She started small, asking him what he thought about the weather, the books he was reading, or the games he liked to play. Eventually, Aiden began to open up, if only a little at first. Chloe, on the other hand, had a sharp edge. Her sarcasm, her eye rolls, her tendency to shut down emotionally, it was all a result of the environment she had been raised in. Helen had dealt with children like Chloe before. She knew that what she saw wasn't the real Chloe. It was a defense mechanism. Chloe had learned to protect herself from the emotional neglect by acting out, and Helen wasn't going to let her hide behind that mask forever. Leo, the youngest, was caught in the middle. His behavior was erratic, often needing attention to feel validated. He didn't understand the deeper issues at play, but he felt the tension. Helen watched as Leo would wander from room to room, his bright eyes searching for something, anything, that would make him feel safe. He was the easiest to win over. He didn't carry the baggage the older two had, but his heart was bruised nonetheless. And Helen knew that she had to be the one to help him heal, to teach him that being loved didn't mean being spoiled, but it meant being respected, being guided, and being held accountable. As the days passed, Helen kept a close watch on the children's behavior, observing their reactions, their moods, their small moments of vulnerability. She knew that the real work was happening in the small moments, in the quiet conversations, the subtle shifts in tone, and the moments when they realized that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the enemy. But she knew she couldn't do it alone. Helen had no illusions about how difficult it would be to break through the emotional walls that Brooke had built around her children. She needed help, and not just from the emotional perspective. She needed resources, support, and legal guidance in case things escalated. Helen dialed Carol's number, her fingers moving with practiced ease. Carol had been a trusted friend for years, someone Helen could always rely on for advice and help. This was no different. "Carol, it's me," Helen said, her voice calm but urgent. "I need your help." "Of course, Helen. What's going on?" Carol's voice was always steady, but there was a note of concern now. "I'm not just dealing with Brooke anymore. I'm dealing with her children too," Helen said. "I need to know what resources are available, what steps I need to take to protect them. I don't want to go through this alone." Carol was silent for a moment, then responded with a determination that mirrored Helen. "I'll make some calls, Helen. I'll connect you with my sister at Child Protective Services, and I'll see if I can help with anything legal. We'll get this sorted out." Helen felt a surge of relief wash over her. With Carol's help, she knew she could turn things around. She had a plan, and now she had the resources to make it work. "I appreciate it, Carol," Helen said, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Let's make sure Brooke doesn't get away with this. This time I'm taking control." Helen hung up the phone and turned back to the children, who were slowly adjusting to their new routine, their small acts of rebellion still simmering just beneath the surface. But she wasn't giving up. Not now, not ever. She had done this before. She had built bridges with children who were lost, who needed someone to guide them, to show them a better way. And she would do it again, this time for her grandchildren. Brooke had started this war, but Helen was ready for battle. And this time she was armed with patience, wisdom, and the support of people who understood what it took to truly protect a family. The groundwork had been laid. Now it was time for the children to learn the truth. The first few days had been a battle of wills. The children came into Helen's home with walls so high, they might as well have been invisible fortresses. Aiden kept his eyes glued to his phone. Chloe crossed her arms and rolled her eyes at every word Helen spoke, and Leo seemed to go wherever the noise was, hopping to disappear in the background. But slowly, as the days wore on, the cracks in their behavior began to show. It was subtle at first. Aiden, who had spent the first few days locked in his digital world, began to spend more time around the dinner table, watching Helen as she moved around the kitchen. He didn't say much, but he was there, sitting quietly, looking at her with something approaching curiosity. Helen noticed the shift immediately, though she didn't comment on it. She simply carried on, offering him food when he seemed hungry, handing him a glass of juice without asking. There was no pressure. There was no rush. By the fourth day, Aiden spoke for the first time since his arrival, and it was an offhand comment, as though it didn't matter at all. But Helen recognized it for what it was, a small opening. "This isn't too bad," Aiden muttered, his voice low as he poked at his pancakes with a fork. "Better than what I thought." Helen smiled quietly to herself, but she didn't respond. She didn't need to. That was the first real sign that he was starting to see her, not as the old, boring woman who had been forced on him, but as someone different, someone who had more to offer than just what his mother had said. The real change came the next morning when Chloe, who had been the most resistant to any kind of structure, began to speak differently. Helen had suggested they all help out with a simple task, setting the table for breakfast. Chloe had reluctantly agreed, but as she worked, she let slip something that made Helen's heart beat a little faster. "I don't get it," Chloe said, her voice soft but edged with confusion. "Mom always said I shouldn't do stuff like this. She'd do it all for us, you know. Why do you want us to help?" Helen paused, wiping her hands on the dish towel, and looked at Chloe carefully. "Because you're part of this family," she said quietly. "And families help each other. It's not about doing things for you, it's about doing things together." Chloe didn't respond right away, but Helen could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. There was something there, something Helen hadn't expected. A crack in the wall of loyalty that had been built between them by Brooke's manipulation. Later that day, as Helen and the children sat down for lunch, Leo made a hesitant comment that caught everyone off guard. "Grandma," he said, looking at her with those big, earnest eyes, "why did Mom always tell us not to visit you? You're nice, and your food isn't so bad. I kind of like it." Helen's heart ached for him, for all the children. They had been made to feel like her love wasn't enough, that her care wasn't worth their time. But now, for the first time, Leo was seeing the truth. He wasn't the lost little boy who had been taught to shut her out. He was beginning to understand that love wasn't something you had to earn with extravagant gifts or trips to fancy places. Love was about showing up, about being there, and about treating each other with respect. Helen's smile was soft, her voice gentle. "Thank you, Leo. I'm glad you like it here." It was a small moment, but it was significant. Helen knew the battle wasn't won yet, but these little shifts were telling her something important. The children were beginning to see things differently. That evening, as they all gathered in the living room, Leo sat closer to Helen than he had in the beginning. He reached for a photo album on the shelf, and without hesitation, handed it to her. "Can you tell me about these?" he asked, pointing to the old black and white photographs of Michael as a child. "You look really young here. Was that when you were happy?" Helen's throat tightened, and for a moment she wasn't sure how to respond. She hadn't been asked to share her past with anyone in years, especially not with a child so young. But as she looked at Leo, her heart softened. This wasn't just a child asking about her history. This was a child trying to understand them. "Yes," she replied, her voice calm and full of warmth. "That was a good time, Leo, but happiness doesn't come just from looking back. It comes from building something new, something real every day. And that's what we're doing here, together." Leo's expression changed, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. For the first time since he'd arrived, he wasn't fidgeting, wasn't seeking something to distract him. He was present, truly, fully present. Later that evening, as the children settled in for bed, Helen sat on the edge of Chloe's bed for a moment, just watching her, taking in the quiet transformation that had begun to take root. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was progress. Chloe, who had been so resistant to anything resembling affection, had let her guard down enough to talk openly about the things that bothered her. It wasn't a perfect conversation, but it was the beginning of something Helen had been longing for. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" Chloe said, her voice tentative as she hugged her knees to her chest. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" "I don't get why Mom doesn't want us to spend time with you," Chloe said, her eyes avoiding Helen for a moment. She says stuff about you, that you're boring and not good for us. But you're not like that. Why does she say that?" Helen's heart broke a little for Chloe, for all the children. Brooke had done a number on them, had twisted their reality so much that they didn't even know which way was up anymore. But here, in this moment, Chloe was questioning it. She was beginning to see the cracks in the facade, the lies that had been fed to her for so long. "I don't know, Chloe." Helen replied gently, her voice soft with emotion. "Sometimes people say things that aren't true because they're scared, or maybe because they want to control things. But none of it's your fault. You're not the ones who are wrong, and if you ever want to know the truth, you'll always have a place with me." Chloe's eyes softened, and for the first time since she had arrived, she didn't seem so closed off. There was a flicker of something, understanding, perhaps, or maybe just a glimpse of hope that things could be different. As Helen walked back to her room that night, she knew the work was far from over. There were still walls to break, still truths to uncover, still deep wounds to heal. But she had seen the first signs, the glimmer of change that in time would grow into something powerful. The children were beginning to question the world they had been taught to believe in. They were starting to see that love wasn't a manipulation, but a bond that could be trusted. And that, Helen knew, was the first step toward breaking the chains of loyalty they had been forced to build around their mother. She wasn't just helping them see the truth about their mother. She was helping them see the truth about themselves, who they were, who they could become. And no matter how long it took, Helen was determined to be the one who helped them find their way. It was a quiet morning when Helen sat down at the kitchen table, a cup of tea cradled between her hands. The house was still, the children still asleep, and it felt like the calm before a storm. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that she was missing a key piece to understanding just how deep Brooke's manipulations ran. She had seen the cracks forming in the children's walls, Aiden's quiet moments, Chloe's hesitant questions, Leo's small acts of affection. But something still didn't add up. Helen knew better than to ignore her instincts. She had spent too many years teaching children, reading between the lines, picking up on things they didn't say aloud. And now, she knew there was more to Brooke's actions than she had let on. Aiden's phone, which he had carelessly left behind on the couch the previous night, was sitting on the coffee table in front of her. She hadn't planned on snooping, but her gaze lingered on it, and her mind wandered back to the moment when Aiden had carelessly tossed his phone aside without a second thought. His lack of concern seemed like an invitation, one she couldn't ignore. She picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly as she unlocked it. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but deep down, she knew she needed to find the truth, the whole truth, about what had been going on behind her back. What she discovered next would change everything. The first thing that caught her eye was a string of text messages between Aiden and someone named Dominic. She had heard that name before, of course. Leo had mentioned it casually, but it had meant little to her at the time. As she scrolled through the conversations, the full picture began to emerge, piece by agonizing piece. The texts were laced with casual cruelty, as though Dominic was part of the family, but in a way that made Helen's stomach turn. It was the way he spoke to Aiden, dismissive, almost fatherly, but in a way that felt wrong. Helen's eyes narrowed as she read the words. "Brooke says we'll be fine, Aiden. She's already making plans for you guys. Miami's just the start. Once everything is settled, we'll leave it all behind. You won't have to see her again." Helen felt the breath catch in her throat. Leave her? The words echoed in her mind, the weight of the sentence hanging over her like a suffocating cloud. Helen read on, her heart pounding, trying to process the words. Don't worry about your dad. He won't even notice. He's too busy working. Helen's eyes darted to the next message. Brooke, been setting everything up. We'll have the house ready by the time the kids are taken care of. You know how it goes. She'll make sure things work out. Just keep your head down. The words were cold, methodical, devoid of any real care for the children. It was clear to Helen now. Brooke wasn't just trying to manipulate her. She was planning something much worse. She was plotting to steal her own children away and disappear with them, leaving Michael and Helen in the dust. It wasn't just neglect anymore. It was betrayal. Helen's hand shook as she scrolled further, the messages becoming more sinister. A few more texts were exchanged between Brooke and Dominic, and it was clear that they had been planning this for months, carefully laying the groundwork for their escape to Miami. We need to make sure Michael signs everything, no questions asked. He's too tired to fight for custody. Once we're in Miami, it'll be too late. And the kids, we'll get them to believe whatever we want. They don't have to know the truth. The words struck Helen like a punch to the gut. Brooke wasn't just planning to leave Michael. She was going to take his children, and she was willing to destroy everything for it. Helen set the phone down, her mind racing. She had suspected that there was something off about Brooke's behavior, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. Brooke had used manipulation and lies to carve a wedge between Helen and the children, but this was far more calculated, far more dangerous. She sat back in the chair, her heart heavy with the emotional toll of what she had just uncovered. She could feel the weight of the evidence pressing down on her, the burden of knowing just how deep the deception ran. Her mind was racing, but her resolve began to form in the midst of the storm of thoughts. Helen knew she couldn't ignore this. She couldn't pretend that everything would just work itself out. No, she had to act, but she couldn't do it alone. The stakes were too high, and this was no longer just about her relationship with the children. This was about protecting them from the lies and the toxic web that Brooke had spun. The first step was clear. She needed to confront the truth, not just with the children, but with Michael as well. But more than that, she needed to prepare. She reached for her phone again, her fingers moving with purpose now. She dialed Carol's number, and when her old friend picked up, Helen didn't waste any time. "Carol, it's time," Helen said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "I've found the proof. Brooke is planning to take the kids, and she's been lying to everyone, Michael, the kids, even me. I need your help. We need to move fast." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then Carol's voice came through, calm but concerned. "What do you need, Helen?" "I need everything. I need resources, legal advice, everything I can get my hands on. I can't do this alone. The kids, Aiden, Chloe, Leo, they're going to need someone who understands what's happening. They need to hear the truth, and we need to stop Brooke before she does any more damage." "I'm on it," Carol replied without hesitation. "I'll reach out to my contacts. I'll make sure we get everything we need. You're not alone in this, Helen." Helen breathed a little easier, the weight on her chest lifting slightly. Carol was there, and with Carol's help, she knew they could bring the truth to light. But it was going to take everything she had, every ounce of patience, every ounce of love, and every ounce of strength she had left. As Helen hung up the phone, she glanced back at Aiden's phone, the messages still fresh in her mind. The truth was out there now. It was all coming together, and no matter how dark the road ahead might be, Helen was ready to face it. She wouldn't let Brooke get away with this. Not this time. The stakes had never been higher. But for the first time in years, Helen was certain of one thing. She was not going to back down, not when it came to protecting her family. Helen sat alone in the dim light of the living room, the quiet of the house almost suffocating. Her tea had gone cold, but she hadn't moved to drink it. Her eyes were fixed on the photo frame on the mantel, a black-and-white picture of Michael from his childhood. She remembered the little boy, full of hope and joy, before life had become so complicated. But now it was Michael's children, her grandchildren, who occupied her thoughts. She had come to realize something crucial. The real battle wasn't just about protecting the kids from Brooke's lies. It was about breaking the psychological grip Brooke had over them. The manipulation was deep, the emotional wounds vast, and Helen was at the center of it all, caught between the love she had for her family and the bitterness of what had been done to her. As she reflected on her years of sacrifice for Michael, she remembered the many ways Brooke had made her feel small, insignificant, like a relic from the past. Brooke had dismissed her, made her feel irrelevant, as though her presence was a burden. Helen had spent so many years fighting for her family, for Michael, that she had lost sight of herself. But now, with the children in her home, she saw the manipulation for what it was, calculated, deliberate, and aimed at making her feel powerless. Brooke's words echoed in her mind, even now, like a haunting refrain. "You're just a grandmother, Helen. You're just an old woman who doesn't matter." The sting of those words cut deep, but Helen wasn't going to let them define her anymore. She had spent a lifetime teaching children to find their voice, to stand up for what was right, to see through the fog of lies. Now it was her turn. The hardest part of this journey wasn't the manipulations Brooke had inflicted on her. It was seeing the damage Brooke had done to her grandchildren. Helen had to remind herself that they were just children, deeply confused by the world they had been raised in. They had been made to believe that she was the villain, that her love was conditional, that her motives were selfish. But that was not who Helen was. She had spent decades dedicating herself to children who were not her own, nurturing their growth and giving them love. Still, the emotional toll of fighting for the truth was real. Helen would wake up in the middle of the night, her heart racing with doubts. Am I doing the right thing? She would wonder. Is it too late to break through? She had moments of fear, moments where she questioned if she was strong enough to undo the damage Brooke had caused. But each time she looked at the children, each time she saw the vulnerability hidden behind their walls, her resolve grew stronger. Helen knew she couldn't do it alone. She had Carol, who was helping with legal support. But she also knew that the real work, the real transformation, was going to come from her. She had to give the children something Brooke hadn't: trust, consistency, love without strings attached. She was more than just an old teacher. She was a woman with experience, wisdom, and the fierce love of a grandmother who wouldn't let her family fall apart. This wasn't just about the kids learning the truth about their mother. It was about Helen reclaiming her own power, showing them that real love wasn't manipulation. It was sacrifice, it was standing firm, and it was being there when it mattered most. Brooke had played the psychological games for far too long. Now it was Helen's turn to take control. But as she prepared herself for the next steps, she knew it wouldn't be easy. Every move she made would be carefully calculated. And yet, each time she looked at those children, her grandchildren, the ones she had so desperately wanted to love and protect, she knew this battle was worth it. The days passed slowly, but Helen felt a subtle shift each time she interacted with the children. At first, it was nothing more than small moments: a hesitant smile from Leo, a brief glance of curiosity from Aiden as he watched her in the kitchen, a softening in Chloe's sharp tone when she spoke to her. They were the tiniest cracks in the walls that Brooke had built around them, but to Helen, they were everything. It was on the 7th day that the real breakthrough came. Helen had just finished preparing a big pot of chili, a recipe passed down from her mother, and she called the kids to the table. Aiden came in first, his eyes still glued to his phone, but as soon as he saw the food, he put it down and sat at the table. It wasn't the usual struggle, the usual sighs of disappointment. This time, there was a quiet acceptance. "Smells good," Aiden said, as though the words had been forced out, but there was no sarcasm behind them. Just simple, unadulterated truth. Chloe followed, looking less combative than before. Her arms weren't crossed, her eyes weren't rolling. She didn't say anything, but she sat down beside Aiden and started eating. Leo, as always, was the first to speak up after taking a bite. "This is the best chili I've ever had," he said, his mouth full, his voice full of surprise. Helen's heart swelled. She didn't need grand gestures from them. This moment was everything. It was proof that they were starting to trust her, that they were starting to see her for who she truly was. A loving, steady presence in their lives, not a burden, not an enemy. After dinner, as they all sat on the couch together, Leo snuggled closer to Helen, his small head resting on her shoulder. She didn't push him away, didn't force him to sit up or be proper. She let him be, knowing that this small act of closeness was more than he had ever allowed before. Chloe, who had been so resistant, spoke up quietly, almost as though she were testing the waters. "Grandma," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, Do you really not mind that we don't like your food?" Helen smiled gently, brushing a stray hair from Chloe's face. "Of course I don't mind, sweetheart. I made it because I wanted you to have something special. But it's okay if you don't like it. I just want you to be honest with me." Chloe hesitated for a moment, then gave a small nod. I guess it's not so bad." It was a simple sentence, but to Helen, it felt like a victory. For the first time in days, Chloe was opening up, letting her guard down. The walls were still there, but they were crumbling little by little. Later that evening, Aiden lingered by the kitchen, pretending to look for something but clearly hesitant. When Helen noticed, she walked over to him. "Looking for something?" she asked, her voice light. Aiden glanced up, his usual defiance replaced with something softer. "I was just wondering, what's your story, Grandma? What was it like when you were my age?" The question caught Helen off guard. She hadn't expected him to ask anything so personal, but she was ready. She took a breath, trying to remember the boy Aiden used to be, the curious, innocent child who had been robbed of his childhood by his mother's manipulation. "Well," she began, sitting down next to him, "when I was your age, I didn't have much. My dad was gone and I had to grow up fast. But I had dreams, Aiden, big dreams, and I worked hard for them even when things were tough. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it." Aiden seemed to absorb her words, nodding slowly. For the first time, he wasn't just hearing her as the boring old woman he had been taught to see. He was seeing her as a real person who had lived a life, who had worked hard, who had struggled. Helen wasn't the enemy. She was something more. And for the first time, Aiden seemed to understand that. The night ended quietly, but the emotional shift was palpable. Chloe and Leo were both asleep, and Aiden, though still a little distant, was more present than he had been in the past. Helen looked at them, a quiet sense of hope blooming in her chest. The children were beginning to see the truth. Slowly, gently, they were starting to realize that their grandmother wasn't the villain in their lives. She was the one who would fight for them, who would give them the love they so desperately needed. And in their hearts, Helen knew that this was just the beginning. The night before everything was set in motion, Helen sat at the kitchen table, the light from the overhead lamp casting long shadows over her weary face. Her hands were steady, but her mind was racing. The plan had come together piece by piece over the past few days, each step carefully calculated, each move deliberate. And now it was almost time. Beside her, Michael sat, his jaw clenched in frustration. His hands were curled into fists, his fingers tapping nervously on the table as he stared into the distance. It was clear the weight of what they were about to face was beginning to sink in. Helen had known Michael for most of his life. She had raised him through every trial, every hardship, but this was different. This was not just about her. This was about his family, his children, his life with Brooke. He had spent years excusing her behavior, rationalizing the lies, convincing himself that everything was fine, that this was just how relationships worked. But now the truth was unavoidable. The truth Helen had uncovered, the messages, the lies, the betrayal, it was all too much for Michael to ignore. "I can't believe I didn't see it sooner," Michael said softly, his voice thick with guilt. "I never realized how deep this went, Mom. I thought I was protecting them, protecting her, but all I did was enable it." Helen placed a hand gently on his, her touch grounding him. "Michael, none of this is your fault. You were manipulated and it was hard for you to see it. But now you're doing what you need to do for them, for your children. This is the first step." The conversation had turned to the plan they had developed. They were going to confront Brooke when she returned. But this time, they wouldn't be alone. Mr. Martinez, the family lawyer, had prepared all the legal documents, papers that would protect Michael's rights and the children's future. They would not let Brooke manipulate the situation any longer. "I'm scared," Michael admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Scared for the kids, scared of what she'll do, but most of all, I'm scared of how I didn't see it before. How could I have been so blind, Mom? Helen squeezed his hand, her voice firm but gentle. The truth is hard to face, Michael, but you are doing the right thing now. We all are. Tomorrow, Brooke will see that things are different, that we're not backing down anymore. It's not just about her. It's about the future of this family, and we're going to take it back. Michael nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. He wasn't alone anymore. Helen was there, standing beside him as she always had. As the night wore on, the final preparations were made. The lawyer would arrive in the morning, bringing with him the legal documents that would give Michael the upper hand. Helen had done everything she could. She had the evidence, the support, and the strength to back it all up. Now all that was left was to wait. The day had arrived, and the tension in the house was palpable. Helen stood in the living room, her back straight, her shoulders squared. The final confrontation was moments away. She had known this day would come. She had spent years preparing for it, in ways she didn't even realize until now. As the clock ticked closer to noon, the sound of an engine rumbled down the street. Brooke was here. The doorbell rang, sharp and jarring. Helen's heart fluttered, but she didn't show it. She had prepared herself for this moment. She wouldn't back down. Michael stood by her side, his expression hard, determined. He wasn't the man who had allowed himself to be manipulated anymore. He had made his decision. This time, he was going to protect his children, and he wasn't going to let Brooke walk all over him again. Brooke stepped inside, her presence as imposing as ever. She was dressed in a tight-fitting dress that Helen knew cost more than her pension, carrying a Louis Vuitton suitcase that screamed entitlement. The woman who had caused so much pain to their family was standing there, expecting to regain control, expecting things to go back to how they were. But she was met with a completely different atmosphere. "Michael, why are you here?" Brooke said, her voice dripping with a fake sweetness that Helen had long since stopped tolerating. "And Mom, what's this all about?" Helen didn't respond right away. She didn't have to. The room was charged with an energy that Brooke couldn't ignore. "I'm not here to play games anymore, Brooke," Michael said, his voice steady, his eyes locking with hers. "You're not going to manipulate me or the kids anymore. You've lied, you've stolen, and now it's time to face the consequences." Brooke's eyes narrowed, her facade beginning to crack. "What are you talking about? This is ridiculous, Michael. You're tired, I get it. I've been dealing with a lot, but we'll work through it." Helen stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "No, Brooke, it's over. I know everything. The lies, the manipulation, the deceit, and it's not just about you anymore. This is about your children, and you're not going to get away with it." Brooke's eyes flickered with panic, but she quickly masked it with a sneer. "What do you think you're going to do, Helen? You think I'm going to let you take everything from me?" "I'm not taking anything from you, Brooke," Helen replied, her tone cool. "You've already taken everything from yourself. You've lied, you've manipulated, and now you're going to pay for it." Michael placed a thick stack of papers on the table in front of her. "This is the divorce petition, the custody papers, and the evidence we have of your fraud and emotional abuse. It's over. You're not taking my children." Brooke's face contorted with anger. She took a step toward the door, but Helen stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "You think you can intimidate me?" Brooke hissed. "You think I'm afraid of you, Helen? You're nothing but an old woman who's trying to ruin my life." Helen stood her ground. "No, Brooke, you ruined your own life, and now you'll have to face the consequences." Brooke's face paled as she realized what was happening. She wasn't in control anymore. This wasn't the same family she had manipulated for years. Michael had taken a stand, and so had Helen. Brooke's desperate attempts to regain control became more frantic with each passing second. She paced the room, her hands shaking with rage as she tried to twist the situation back in her favor. The calm, calculated demeanor that she had once used to manipulate everyone around her was cracking. "You have no idea what you're doing, Michael," she shouted, her voice breaking with frustration. "You're making a huge mistake. I'm your wife. I'm their mother. You can't just take them away from me." Michael didn't flinch. "You gave up your right to be their mother the moment you decided to turn them against me, the moment you lied to them, and the moment you abandoned them for your own selfish reasons. You've used them as pawns in your game, Brooke, and I won't stand by and let it happen anymore." Brooke's eyes darted to the door, her mind racing for a way out. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice trembling. "You're all wrong about me. I've been doing everything for this family. You're the one who's always been absent, always too busy with your stupid work. I've kept us together. I've sacrificed everything for you." Helen's patience was beginning to wear thin. "Sacrificed? You've taken everything from Michael. You've taken his trust, his money, his children, and you've tried to take their love, too." Brooke looked at the papers on the table, her face turning crimson with fury. "This is illegal," she spat. "You can't just accuse me of these things. You can't ruin my life like this." But deep down, Helen knew, Brooke's facade was crumbling, her carefully constructed world of lies and manipulation was falling apart. The evidence against her was irrefutable. And as her desperation grew, her true character began to emerge, selfish, manipulative, and completely unable to take responsibility for her actions. The room grew heavy with tension as Brooke's defenses finally crumbled. Her lies had been exposed, and she had nowhere left to hide. She was trapped in a corner of her own making. Brooke's last attempt at control came out as a weak whisper. "You'll regret this, Helen. You'll see." But Helen wasn't intimidated. "No, Brooke. You'll regret the day you ever thought you could manipulate my family." Brooke's shoulders slumped, her defiance slowly draining away. The woman who had once ruled their lives with fear was now nothing more than a shadow of her former self. "Get out," Michael said, his voice steady. "It's over." As Brooke turned to leave, she paused at the door, her face twisted with bitterness. "This isn't over. I'll make sure of it." But Helen wasn't worried. She had already won. And this time, Brooke wouldn't have the power to hurt them anymore. It was a slow, gradual transformation, but Helen could see the shift in her grandchildren every day. The early days of tension and rebellion had faded into something else, something more tender. They were learning to see her differently, to trust her again, and in some cases, for the very first time. They were healing, and with each passing day, they were becoming more themselves, no longer weighed down by the shadows of Brooke's manipulation. Aiden, who had been the most resistant, now found himself lingering in the kitchen with her after dinner. At first, it had been nothing more than a silent gesture, a way of passing time, perhaps, before retreating to his phone or his room. But as time wore on, Aiden began to ask questions, curious about Helen's life, her past, and the things she had never shared before. He would ask about her childhood, her school years, the things that shaped her into the woman she was today. Helen saw it for what it was, an invitation. Aiden was finally beginning to see her not just as the old grandmother who lived alone, but as a person, a woman with her own story, her own dreams and experiences. And more importantly, he was beginning to see her as someone who truly cared about him, not as an obligation, but as family. One evening, as they worked side by side in the garden, Aiden stood a little closer to her than usual. He handed her a pair of garden gloves, his hand brushing against hers in an unspoken gesture of connection. "I'm sorry, Grandma," he said quietly, not looking at her, "for the way I treated you before." Helen smiled, her heart swelling. It wasn't much, just a simple apology, but it meant everything. She looked at Aiden, her voice soft and understanding. "You don't have to apologize, sweetheart. You were just doing what you were taught. But now we're learning together, right?" Aiden gave a small nod, his shoulders relaxing. For the first time, he wasn't carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He was just a boy, learning how to be a part of something bigger, something real. Chloe, too, was slowly opening up. She had always been the most resistant to change, her anger often bubbling up at the smallest thing. But the anger was starting to dissipate, replaced by moments of vulnerability. She had started to sit beside Helen during the evenings, talking more than she had before. At first, it had been about trivial things, school, her friends, the latest gossip. But over time, their conversations deepened. Chloe began to ask questions about her own feelings, about why she had acted the way she had toward Helen. "I didn't really know you, Grandma," Chloe said one evening, her voice quiet, almost apologetic. "I thought you were boring, but now I realize I was wrong." Helen's heart ached for her, for all the years they had lost, but she didn't let her emotions show. "You were just confused, Chloe, I understand. But now we have a chance to make things right." Chloe smiled, her eyes softening. The shift wasn't immediate, but it was enough. Enough to make Helen believe that there was hope for them all. Leo, sweet, innocent Leo, had become the glue that was holding them all together. His playful nature, his boundless curiosity, his laughter that filled the house like sunshine, had brought life back into their home. At night, when they gathered for dinner or family time, Leo would sit on Helen's lap, telling her about his day or showing her a drawing he had made. He no longer seemed lost or scared. He had begun to see that family wasn't just about being blood-related. It was about love, trust, and care. "Grandma," Leo said one evening, after a long day spent together in the garden, "I like it here. It's nice." Helen smiled, her heart swelling with love. "I like it here too, Leo. I'm glad you're here with me." The children had come to understand that love wasn't just a concept. It was something they could feel, something that was tangible in the way they spent time together. They were starting to see the truth. Brooke's version of love wasn't real. It was conditional, transactional. But Helen's love, Michael's love, was unconditional. It was a love that had always been there, even when they hadn't realized it. They were growing, learning, and becoming a family again, piece by piece. The emotional walls were coming down, and in their place, something beautiful was emerging. Trust, understanding. A bond that would take years to fully form, but was already stronger than anything Brooke had ever built. The day Michael walked into the lawyer's office was the beginning of a new chapter. It wasn't an easy decision. It wasn't a simple process. But Michael had finally made up his mind. He was done pretending, done ignoring the truth. The custody papers had been filed, and the divorce proceedings had begun. Helen sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm, offering quiet support. It was surreal, the paperwork, the legal jargon, the way the system operated. It all seemed like a distant world to Michael. But it was real. This was happening. Mr. Martinez, the lawyer, was a seasoned professional. He had seen cases like this before, but this one felt different. It was personal. It wasn't just about the legalities. It was about Michael's family, about his children's future, and about protecting them from the woman who had manipulated and twisted their lives for so long. "You're doing the right thing, Michael," Mr. Martinez said, looking him in the eye. "This isn't going to be easy, but we have a strong case. The evidence is clear. You've got the upper hand here." Helen squeezed Michael's hand, offering a small but reassuring smile. She knew how hard this was for him. He was walking away from the woman he had once loved, the woman who had been the mother of his children. But as he sat there, surrounded by legal documents and proof of Brooke's betrayal, Michael knew that this was what needed to happen. He couldn't let her continue to poison his children's minds. He couldn't let her continue to control their lives. The legal battle wasn't going to be fast or easy. It would stretch out for months, maybe even years. But Helen was resolute. She would stand by Michael, by her family, through every step of the process. No matter what. The first hurdle would be the custody hearing. The court would have to decide who would be the best fit for the children. But with the evidence Helen had uncovered, with Michael's unwavering determination, and with the support of Mr. Martinez, Helen felt confident that they could win. It wasn't just about the law. It was about what was right. For the first time in years, Helen felt like the family was taking control. Brooke no longer held the power. The truth had come to light, and now the legal system would do what it was meant to do, protect the innocent. The days stretched on, the court dates looming, but in the midst of the uncertainty, the family was beginning to heal. Michael was no longer the exhausted man who had spent his days buried in work, trying to escape the dysfunction of his life. He was present now. He was here for the children, for Helen, and for himself. The children had adapted to their new routine. They had learned respect, patience, and what it meant to be part of a family. They weren't just the brats their mother had called them. They were his children, their children, and Michael was more involved than ever. He wasn't just the father who worked long hours. He was the father who cooked dinner, who helped with homework, who sat and talked with his children when they needed him. The transformation was most apparent in Aiden. The angry, distant teenager who had once resisted every attempt at connection had begun to open up. He wasn't perfect, not yet, but his bond with Michael was growing stronger every day. He was learning how to be a son again, how to trust his father and his grandmother. There was still a long road ahead, but every small step was a victory. Chloe, too, was showing signs of growth. She had always been the most protective of her emotions, but now she was beginning to let people in. She had started to spend more time with Helen, helping her around the house, talking more openly about her day, about her fears. And most importantly, she was learning to trust again, something that had been taken from her by her mother's manipulation. And Leo, sweet Leo, had become the heart of their home. He had a natural ability to bring joy, even on the toughest days. He would make everyone laugh, lighten the mood, and remind them that love and joy still existed, even in the hardest times. Together, Michael, Helen, and the children were rebuilding their family. They weren't the perfect family. They weren't without scars, but they were whole again, finding their way back to each other, one step at a time. Helen looked around the kitchen one night, watching Michael laugh as he cooked. The children gathered around the table, and her heart swelled with pride. This was what it was all for. This was the life they had fought for. The family was no longer broken. It was stronger than ever. And for the first time in years, Helen could finally say it without a doubt. They were going to be okay. The day had arrived. Helen stood tall, her heart steady, as she watched the clock tick toward the time when Brooke would walk through the door, expecting to regain control. This was it, the final showdown. Helen knew that everything had led up to this moment. Months of preparation, hours of hard work, and the unwavering support of Michael and the children had brought them here. It wasn't just a battle for custody. It was a battle for truth, for the children's futures, and for the family that had been manipulated and torn apart for so long. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway echoed in the stillness of the house. Michael, his face hard with determination, gave Helen a reassuring nod. They had come so far. This was the moment when everything changed. Brooke walked in, wearing the same tight smile that had once deceived them all. But now Helen saw through it. She had no power here anymore, not over Michael, not over the children, not over the truth. Well, 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 Brooke said, her voice dripping with sarcasm as she looked around. What's all this? Michael, why aren't you at work? And Helen, what have you done now? What's all this nonsense about me losing the kids? Helen crossed her arms and met her gaze. It's not nonsense, Brooke. This is the reality. You've lied. You've manipulated. And now you'll face the consequences. Brooke's eyes flickered with panic, but she quickly masked it with a haughty laugh. I'm their mother, Helen. You think you can just take my children from me? Michael's voice was firm, resolute. You gave up the right to be their mother the moment you started lying to them, the moment you decided to put your own selfish desires above their well-being. The tension in the room was palpable. Brooke's eyes darted from Michael to the papers on the table, the evidence that had been gathered against her, the legal documents that were now her undoing. She took a step back, her anger boiling over. This is ridiculous. You're going to regret this, Michael. You can't take my kids from me. But Michael wasn't backing down. We're not taking them from you, Brooke. We're giving them the life they deserve. A life free from manipulation and fear. A life where they know they're loved without conditions. At that moment, the children entered the room, one by one, their faces no longer filled with fear or confusion. They had already made their decision. They had already seen the truth. Aiden spoke first, his voice quiet but firm. We're not going back with you, Mom, not after everything you've done. Chloe stood beside him, her eyes clear, no longer the angry, resentful child she had once been. You've hurt us, Mom, but we've learned the truth now. Grandma and Dad, they've always been there for us. Leo, standing with the older kids, nodded, his innocent face showing a maturity far beyond his years. We don't need you anymore, Mom. We have Grandma and Dad. Brooke's face twisted with fury as she looked at the three of them. Her world was falling apart. You don't know what you're saying, she shouted. I'm your mother, you need me. But the children stood their ground, united in a way they never had been before. They were no longer afraid of her. The truth had freed them. Helen watched the scene unfold before her, her children, her grandchildren, standing together, strong and resolute. It was a bittersweet victory, but it was theirs. "Brooke," Helen said calmly, her voice firm but not unkind, "you no longer have control here. You can sign the divorce papers and leave with what little dignity you have left, or you can fight this in court. But know this, you'll lose. You've lost everything you had, and now you'll lose your children, too." Brooke's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of her. She had no power anymore, no one to manipulate, and as much as she wanted to fight, she knew she was defeated. With a defeated sigh, she grabbed the papers from the table, signing them in silence. Her face was a mask of anger and resentment, but the children didn't look at her. They didn't need to. Brooke walked out of the house, leaving the family behind. As the door closed behind her, Helen felt the weight of the years lift from her shoulders. They had done it. The family had won. In the weeks that followed, the change in the household was almost tangible. The atmosphere was lighter. The kids, now freed from the emotional manipulation they had endured for so long, began to relax. There was a new warmth in the house, a warmth that hadn't been there before. Michael, no longer weighed down by guilt or confusion, was fully present with his children. He helped with their homework, took them to sports games, and showed them the love and attention they had always deserved. And Helen, who had fought so hard to bring this family back together, found herself embracing a new role, one of not just grandmother, but of a loving, guiding force in her grandchildren's lives. Aiden, Chloe, and Leo had settled into a routine. Aiden was more respectful, his anger now tempered with understanding. Chloe had started to speak to Helen more openly, sharing her thoughts and fears. And Leo, who had once been the most distant, now sought out Helen for comfort, for stories, and for guidance. They were healing little by little from the wounds of the past. They had their challenges. There were moments of tension, of awkwardness, of tears. But the difference now was that they were a family. They were united, stronger than they had ever been before. The house, which had once felt cold and lifeless, was now filled with laughter, with love, with the simple joys of being together. Michael and Helen cooked meals together, the children helped set the table, and for the first time in a long time, they all sat down for dinner as a family. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was enough. The children had learned to appreciate the little things, the small acts of kindness, the quiet moments of connection. They no longer took them for granted. They understood now that family wasn't just about being there when it was convenient. It was about support, sacrifice, and unconditional love. Helen watched them with pride, her heart full. They had all come so far, and as much as they had lost, they had gained so much more. Months passed, and the wounds from the past slowly began to heal. Michael, with the support of Helen and the children, had found new strength in himself. He had learned to be present in his family's life, to lead with love and respect, not just with authority. He had rediscovered what it meant to be a father, and not just a provider. The children, too, had flourished. Aiden, once distant and full of anger, was now a young man with a purpose. He had found his place in the world, and his relationship with his father was stronger than ever. Chloe, with her newfound understanding of family, had blossomed into a more compassionate, empathetic person. And Leo, the youngest, had begun to explore his own passions and talents, unburdened by the toxic shadows that had once loomed over him. Helen, though older, felt more alive than she had in years. She had spent so many years focusing on others, on Michael and the children, that she had lost sight of her own dreams. But now she was reclaiming them. She had started teaching art classes to neighborhood children, filling her days with creativity and joy. She had found a new purpose, one that was entirely her own. And Michael had helped her. When he saw how much it meant to her, he had encouraged her to expand her little art school. Together, they built a proper classroom in the backyard, a place where Helen could teach not just her grandchildren, but the children of their community. It was a place where kids could create, learn, and grow, just as Helen had always wanted. The family was stronger than ever. The simple joys of being together, of cooking, of talking, of just being, became their foundation. They no longer took each other for granted. They had learned, through their struggles, the value of unconditional love and respect. And as Helen looked around at the family she had fought so hard to protect, she knew that everything she had done, every sacrifice, every moment of pain had been worth it. They had survived. They had healed. And they had become something beautiful, a family, whole and unbroken. Life had given them a second chance, and they were going to make the most of it.